This is the story of how Britain made its final World War II debt payment on December 29, 2006, 61 years after the war ended, settling a loan that had doubled in value through accumulated interest. Winston Churchill famously called America's Lend-Lease program the most unsordid act in the whole of recorded history, but the reality tells a different story entirely. Britain received $31.4 billion only after the US Treasury verified that British gold reserves had collapsed by 99.7%, dropping from $4.2 billion down to just $12 million. What began as essential wartime aid became the tool America used to dismantle the British Empire's economic foundations. Britain's situation by late 1940 was nothing short of catastrophic. Before Lend-Lease even existed, Britain purchased all war materials under what were called cash and carry provisions, which meant paying cash upfront and transporting everything on British ships. By the end of 1940, this arrangement had pushed the country to the edge of bankruptcy, and that's when things got interesting. November 23, 1940, British Ambassador Lord Lothian stepped off a plane at LaGuardia Airport and delivered a stunning line to waiting reporters. "Well, boys, Britain's broke. It's your money we want." Churchill privately questioned whether such bluntness served British interests, but Lothian was simply stating facts that couldn't be hidden much longer. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. responded by presenting British officials with a detailed list of British holdings in the United States and demanding their immediate sale. His message cut straight to the bone. How could Americans justify providing assistance when Britain still possessed valuable American assets? The forced liquidations that followed extracted $833 million worth of British-owned American businesses at prices Churchill privately described as knockdown, which is a polite way of saying robbery. American Viscose Corporation stands out as the most controversial sale in the entire liquidation process. Courtaulds, a British company, owned this subsidiary that controlled 31% of the US rayon market and had assets valued at $128 million. Between 1931 and 1940, the company generated $62 million in profits, and in 1940 alone it earned $7.9 million, up 60% from a decade earlier, which meant this was a highly profitable, growing business being sold under duress. 17 American investment banks led by Morgan Stanley and Dillon Read purchased the entire company for just $54 million, then turned around and resold it for $62 million within months. Banking profits hit approximately $7.8 million plus a $4 million commission, and the purchasing consortium read like a who's who of Wall Street power. Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, Mellon Securities, First Boston, Kidder Peabody, and Smith Barney all got their cut. Churchill described this transaction in cynical fashion in his memoirs, writing that American Viscose had brought far less than it was worth, and when Morgan Stanley's Harold Stanley later asked Churchill to soften this assessment in future editions, he flat out refused. Courtaulds eventually received additional compensation after the war, but here's the thing. That money came from the British government itself following what was described as bitter litigation, not from the American banks who profited from Britain's desperation. The asset stripping went even deeper through what became known as Operation Fish. May 1940, with German invasion threatening, Britain executed the emergency transfer of gold and securities across the Atlantic in what remains the largest physical movement of wealth in recorded history. Between 1,500 and 2,000 tons of gold were shipped to Canada, along with $2.5 billion in gold and securities total, and the Bank of England's vaults were, in their own words, scraped almost bare. 280 tons moved from the Bank of England to Liverpool in May 1940 alone, which gives you a sense of the scale and urgency. Most of this gold went directly to the United States to pay for war supplies, which meant Britain emptied its treasury before America would even consider extending credit. No other Lend-Lease recipient faced this precondition, and that tells you something about the terms being dictated. Compare how Britain and the Soviet Union were treated, and the disparity becomes impossible to ignore. Britain received $31.4 billion, which was 63% of total Lend-Lease aid, while the Soviet Union received $11.3 billion, about 22% of the total. The terms? Completely different, almost as if two separate programs existed. Britain had to liquidate assets before receiving Lend-Lease, but the USSR could receive up to $1 billion without paying interest at all. Article 7 conditions forced Britain to dismantle imperial trade preferences, yet the Soviet Union faced no such requirements and continued doing whatever it wanted. Britain kept making payments all the way until December 2006, while the Soviet Union agreed in 1972 to pay only $722 million, roughly 25% of its initial debt, and even that was never fully paid. March 1942, Roosevelt made the USSR top priority for deliveries and removed the requirement to justify equipment requests, which Britain still had to provide. Stalin later declared that the USSR has fully paid its debts for the Lend-Lease with the blood of its soldiers, and good luck trying that argument in a British Parliament debate. Britain wasn't just sitting there receiving aid without contributing anything back. $6.8 billion in what's called Reverse Lend-Lease flowed from Britain to the United States, representing 87% of all reverse aid from all allies combined. And this contribution tends to disappear from popular narratives about American generosity. Britain transferred radar technology, jet engine designs, proximity fuse design, and atomic bomb research, which were some of the most valuable technological secrets of the entire war. British Reverse Lend-Lease supplied 31% of all supplies used by American troops in the European theater and 90% of their medical supplies. But nobody was tallying this up when Americans later complained about British ingratitude. August 21, 1945, just days after Japan's surrender, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease without warning, and what economist John Maynard Keynes had called financial Dunkirk arrived right on schedule. The decision blindsided British officials so completely that Prime Minister Attlee appeared pale and plainly disquieted when he heard the news. Britain's economy was still geared for war, with 55% of GDP in 1944 devoted to military production, and you couldn't just flip a switch and turn that off overnight. The American domestic reaction tells you everything you need to know about who held the power. Time magazine reported not a single senator was publicly critical, and editorialists praised Truman's business-like approach while Britain's financial system teetered on collapse. What came next was the 1945-1946 Anglo-American Financial Agreement, which forced Britain into accepting commercial terms for what its negotiators believed should have been an outright grant recognizing wartime sacrifice. Britain received a $3.75 billion line of credit at 2% annual interest payable over 50 annual installments, plus another $586 million for retained Lend-Lease goods. Canada provided an additional loan of over $1 billion, and all of it came with conditions that would reshape the global economic order. Sterling had to be made freely convertible to dollars by July 15, 1947, which sounds technical until you see what happened next. When convertibility was implemented, nations with sterling balances drained nearly $1 billion from British reserves within 1 month, forcing Britain to suspend convertibility after just 6 weeks. The pound was subsequently devalued in 1949 from $4.02 down to $2.80, wiping out a generation of savings and prestige. Britain also had to abandon imperial preference, which was the network of preferential trade relationships with Commonwealth nations that formed the economic backbone of the entire British Empire. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had testified before Congress that imperial preferences represented the greatest injury in a commercial way that has been inflicted on this country since I have been in public life, making American intentions crystal clear. Keynes negotiated the loan and died shortly afterward, with his biographer suggesting that exhaustion from the grueling negotiations contributed to his death. Standing in the House of Lords, Keynes remarked that American negotiators were interested not in our wounds but in our convalescence, adding that they wanted to be told that we intended to walk without bandages as soon as possible, which was a diplomat's way of saying Britain was expected to pretend everything was fine. Economic crises forced Britain to defer payments 6 times in 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976, extending the loan well beyond its original 50-year term. December 29, 2006, the final installment of $83.25 million to the United States and $22.7 million to Canada was finally paid, closing a chapter that had lasted 61 years. $7.5 billion to the US and $2 billion to Canada. That's what Britain ultimately repaid, nearly double the original loan value through accumulated interest over 6 decades. Treasury Minister Ed Balls stated that This week, we finally honor in full our commitments to the US and Canada for the support they gave us 60 years ago, while British newspapers marked the occasion with headlines like, "Farewell to Britain's US mortgage from hell." Was Lend-Lease the most unsordid act Churchill publicly claimed, or was it what historian Robert Skidelsky argues, America's lever to destroy Britain's pre-war financial and trading system? The program unquestionably provided material support that kept Britain in the war against Nazi Germany, and without it, Britain might have faced defeat or negotiated surrender. But here's what Britain paid for that support: asset liquidations at fire sale prices, strategic bases transferred for 99 years, imperial trade preferences dismantled, and sterling forced into premature convertibility that triggered economic crises for decades. Keynes himself called it a financial disaster, and the $31.4 billion in aid came bundled with conditions that accelerated the end of Britain as a global power while establishing American economic supremacy. Britain made that last payment in December 2006, 61 years after the war ended. The empire whose economic foundations Lend-Lease helped dismantle had vanished decades earlier, and the special relationship had become one between a superpower and a diminished ally, still paying off debts from a war that ended before most people watching this video were born. The program's legacy isn't about wartime generosity or calculated exploitation as separate things, but about how existential crisis transforms the terms on which allies negotiate and how those terms shape the world that follows for generations.